1. The shuttle bus doors hissed open with a mechanical sigh that seemed to echo the reluctance in Elena Martinez's chest. She stepped onto the cracked asphalt of Northwind Academy, the premier drone warfare training facility, where the morning sun cast long shadows across a compound that looked more like a fortress than a school. The buildings rose in stark concrete blocks, their surfaces broken only by narrow windows that reflected the desert sky like suspicious eyes. Security towers dotted the perimeter, their sensors tracking every movement within the razor wire fence that separated this place from the outside world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Elena adjusted. The worn strap of her canvas messenger bag, the weight of her few possessions pulling at her shoulder. Her civilian clothes, faded jeans, a simple gray sweater, and scuffed sneakers marked her immediately as different from the crisp uniforms and polished boots she glimpsed through the facility's entrance. She had no military background, no family legacy of service, no sponsor from the defense establishment. What she had was a letter of acceptance that had arrived 3 weeks ago, stamped with official seals she didn't recognize and signed by administrators she'd never heard of. The acceptance had come as a shock. She'd applied to Northwind on a whim after reading about their new civilian integration program, never expecting her background in computer engineering and her hobby of building racing drones in her garage would be enough to catch their attention. The letter had been brief, almost dismissive. Provisional acceptance pending evaluation. Report to intake processing. No congratulations, no welcome, just instructions and a bus ticket. As she walked toward the main building, Elena noticed groups of students already moving with the confident stride of those who belonged. Their flight suits bore patches indicating advanced training levels, squadron assignments, and achievement. Badges that gleamed in the morning light. They spoke in technical jargon she only partially understood, their voices carrying the authority of people who had never doubted their place in the world. None of them looked in her direction. The intake office was a sterile room, filled with the hum of fluorescent lights and the click of keyboards. Behind a metal desk sat a sergeant whose nameplate read Morrison, his face weathered by years of evaluating hopefuls and washing out the weak. He glanced up from his computer screen when Elena approached, his eyes taking in her civilian appearance with obvious skepticism. "Name," he said without preamble. "Elena Martinez." Morrison's fingers moved across his keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Says here you're part of the civilian pilot program. No prior military experience, no ROTC, no family military background." He looked up at her with the expression of someone who had just discovered something unpleasant on the bottom of his shoe. "You sure you're in the right place?" Elena met his gaze steadily. "Unsure." Morrison shrugged and handed her a badge with her photo and a barcode that would track her every movement on the base. "Dorm assignment is Building C, room 247. Classes start tomorrow at 0600. Don't be late." He was already looking past her to the next person in line before she had fully turned away. Building C turned out to be the oldest structure on the base. Its corridors lined with painted cinder blocks and illuminated by harsh strip lighting that flickered occasionally. Elena's room was on the second floor, down a hallway that echoed with the sounds of other students settling in. Her roommate assignment sheet was blank apparently. No one else had been assigned to share the small space with its twin beds, metal lockers, and single window that looked out onto the base's garbage collection area. She set her bag on the bed nearest the window and began unpacking her few belongings. A change of clothes, toiletries, her laptop, and at the bottom of the bag, wrapped carefully in an old t-shirt, the flight controller she had built herself. It was nothing fancy, just circuit boards and wiring housed in a 3D printed case, but it had helped her win 3 amateur drone racing competitions in her hometown. She placed it on the small desk and plugged in her laptop, the familiar blue glow of the screen providing some comfort in the institutional starkness of her new home. That evening, Elena made her way to the dining hall, following signs posted in multiple languages and the steady stream of students moving in the same direction. The hall was vast, filled with long tables where groups clustered according to some invisible social hierarchy she didn't yet understand. She took a tray and moved through the serving line, accepting the standard portions of protein substitute, rehydrated vegetables, and nutritional bread without complaint. At the end of the line she paused, looking out over the sea of occupied tables, searching for an empty seat. Most tables were full, the conversation flowing freely among students who had clearly known each other for months or years. She spotted a few empty chairs scattered among different groups, but something in the body language of their occupants suggested these spaces weren't truly available. Finally, she found a table near the back of the hall where a lone chair sat empty at one end, far enough from the other occupants that she could eat without intruding on their conversation. As she ate, Elena listened to the discussions around her. Talk of flight hours and simulation scores, complaints about instructors and excitement about upcoming exercises. She heard names dropped casually: Black Hawk Squadron, the Talon program, Operation Desert Shield, references that meant nothing to her but clearly carried weight among the speakers. Occasionally, someone would glance in her direction, and she caught fragments of whispered conversations. Civilian program, diversity quota, probably won't last a week. The next morning came early, announced by an alarm system that cut through the pre-dawn darkness with mechanical precision. Elena had been awake for an hour, unable to sleep in the unfamiliar environment, so she was dressed and ready when the first bell rang. She made her way to the classroom building through corridors filled with students moving with military efficiency toward their assigned destinations. The introductory briefing was held in an amphitheater-style room where rows of seats descended toward a large screen at the front. Elena found a seat in the back row, her civilian clothes making her self-conscious among the sea of flight suits. At precisely 0600, the lights dimmed and the screen came to life with the Northwind Academy seal, followed by the image of a stern-faced woman in a general's uniform. "Welcome to Advanced Drone Warfare Training," the woman began, her voice carrying clearly through the room's sound system. "You are here because you have demonstrated exceptional aptitude in unmanned aerial systems operations. Over the next 12 weeks, you will be pushed beyond your comfort zone, challenged in ways you have never experienced, and trained to operate the most sophisticated drone warfare platforms in the world." The presentation continued with statistics. About the Academy's success rate, only 60% of students completed the program, and the career opportunities awaiting graduates. Elena took careful notes, writing in a small notebook she had brought, conscious that she was the only person in the room not using a military-issued tablet. When the general mentioned the program would culminate in a final simulation exercise that would determine each student's placement in the operational fleet, Elena felt her pulse quicken. This was what she had come for, the chance to prove that her unconventional background could be an asset rather than a liability. After the briefing, students were divided into training groups based on their experience levels and career tracks. Elena found herself assigned to Group 7, labeled as Special Integration Candidates, along with 12 other students who seemed equally out of place in the military environment. Their first instructor was Captain Rodriguez, a compact woman with sharp eyes and prematurely gray hair, who looked like she had seen enough combat to last several lifetimes. "Let's be clear about something," Captain Rodriguez began as she faced the group in a small classroom filled with computer workstations. "You're here because the military needs to adapt to changing warfare paradigms. Drone operations require a different skill set than traditional piloting, and some of our best operators have come from unexpected backgrounds. But that doesn't mean you get a pass on discipline, precision, or performance. In this room, everyone starts at zero. The First week of training was a blur of technical instruction and basic military protocol. Elena learned the proper way to salute, how to maintain her equipment, and the chain of command that governed every aspect of life at Northwind. But it was the technical training where she felt most comfortable. The drone systems they studied were far more advanced than anything she had worked with, but the underlying principles were familiar. Flight dynamics, sensor integration, communication protocols concepts she had taught herself through years of building and flying her own machines. During simulation exercises, Elena quickly discovered that her unconventional background was both an asset and a liability. While other students struggled with the intuitive aspects of drone control, understanding how the aircraft would respond to inputs they couldn't feel directly, Elena's years of racing drones had given her an almost instinctive sense of how to manage vehicles through remote interfaces. But she lacked the tactical knowledge that came naturally to students with military backgrounds, the understanding of doctrine and procedure that informed every decision in combat operations. Captain Rodriguez noticed her performance during the second week of training. After a simulation exercise where Elena had successfully navigated a complex urban environment but failed to follow proper reconnaissance protocols, the instructor approached her workstation. "Martinez," she said quietly, "you have good hands for this work. Natural spatial awareness, quick reflexes, good situational judgment under pressure. But you need to learn that, in military operations, how you accomplish a mission is just as important as whether you accomplish it. Precision and protocol save lives." Elena nodded, accepting the feedback without defensiveness. She had always been a quick learner, and she applied herself to studying military doctrine with the same intensity she had once devoted to understanding aerodynamics. She read training manuals late into the night, memorized radio protocols, and practiced standard operating procedures until they became second nature. Slowly, her simulation scores began to improve, not just in technical proficiency, but in adherence to military standards. But as her performance improved, Elena became increasingly aware of the social dynamics that governed life at Northwind Academy. The students were stratified into clear hierarchies based on background, connections, and perceived potential. At the top were the legacy students, those whose parents or grandparents had served with distinction, who had grown up on military bases and absorbed the culture through osmosis. Below them were the academy graduates, young officers who had excelled in traditional military education and been selected for drone warfare training as a career advancement opportunity. Elena found herself in the lowest tier, along with other civilian integration students and a few enlisted personnel who were being retrained from other military specialties. They were tolerated rather than welcomed, their presence explained by administrative necessity rather than genuine acceptance. In the dining hall, they sat at separate tables. In group exercises, they were paired with each other rather than integrated with the higher status students. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. During social events, they stood at the edges of gatherings, invisible unless they made themselves useful. The social isolation became more pronounced as the weeks passed, and the class began to separate into distinct performance groups. Elena's scores placed her consistently in the top quartile, but her civilian background meant she was excluded from the informal networks where real learning took place. She didn't hear about study groups until after they had met, wasn't invited to after-hours training sessions, and found herself cut out of conversations about tactics and strategy that continued long after formal classes ended. The exclusion reached its peak during the fourth week, when students were assigned to squadron formations for advanced tactical training. Elena watched as names were called and groups formed, legacy students gravitating toward each other, academy graduates forming their own clusters. When the assignments were complete, Elena found herself in Squadron Echo, A unit composed entirely of integration students and a few enlisted personnel, who had been relegated to what everyone understood was the lowest tier of the training hierarchy. Squadron Echo's first formation leader was Marcus Chen, a former Air Force radar technician who had been selected for drone training after demonstrating exceptional technical aptitude. He was competent and hardworking, but he lacked the natural leadership presence that commanded respect from other students. During their first group briefing, Elena could see the doubt in his eyes as he looked over his assigned team, a collection of misfits and outsiders, who had been grouped together more by exclusion than by design. "Okay," Marcus began, his voice betraying his uncertainty. "I know we're not the star squadron, but that doesn't mean we can't perform. We're going to focus on fundamentals, support each other, and show them that skill matters more than pedigree." Elena respected his attempt to build morale, but she could see in the faces around her that most of her squadron mates had already internalized their status as second-class students. They participated in exercises with adequate effort but little enthusiasm, accepting their role as training obstacles for the more promising students rather than fighting to prove their own worth. As the training intensified, Elena found herself increasingly isolated even within Squadron Echo. Her performance in simulations was consistently strong, often the best in her group and competitive with the top students from the elite squadrons. But success brought its own problems. When Squadron Echo performed well in exercises, Elena's contributions were often overlooked or attributed to luck. When they struggled, her civilian background became a convenient explanation for the group's failures. The breaking point came during the 6th week when Northwind Academy hosted its monthly social event, a barbecue on the parade ground designed to build camaraderie among the students. Elena attended, hoping that the informal setting might create opportunities to connect with classmates outside the rigid hierarchy of the classroom. She wore her best civilian clothes, khakis, and a button-down shirt that she hoped would help her blend in and approach the event with cautious optimism. The parade ground was transformed for the evening, with picnic tables arranged in casual clusters and a band playing popular music from a stage set up near the flagpole. Students mingled in groups, their conversation mixing shop talk with personal stories and jokes that spoke to shared experiences Elena could only imagine. She moved through the crowd with a plate of food, looking for a familiar face or an opening in a conversation where she might fit. Near the center of the gathering, she spotted a cluster of students from Squadron Alpha, the elite unit composed entirely of legacy students and top academy graduates. They were discussing a recent training exercise, their voices animated with the confidence of people who had never doubted their right to be heard. At their center was Jackson Pierce, the son of a decorated general and the unofficial leader of the Academy's social hierarchy. Elena had noticed him in briefings, where his comments were always received with attention and his questions treated with respect that seemed to have little to do with their actual content. Elena approached the group cautiously, hoping to listen to their discussion of tactics and perhaps contribute her own observations from Squadron Echo's perspective on the same exercise. As she drew closer, Jackson's voice carried clearly across the space. "The problem with these integration programs," he was saying, gesturing with his beer bottle for emphasis, "is that they lower the bar for everyone. We're supposed to be training elite drone operators, but instead we're babysitting civilians who think they can learn in 12 weeks what we've been preparing for our whole lives." The group murmured agreement, and Elena felt her cheeks burn as she realized she had been noticed approaching. Jackson's eyes met hers with a look that combined amusement and disdain. "Speaking of which," he continued, his voice loud enough to carry to nearby groups, "isn't that the garage mechanic who thinks she's going to be a combat pilot?" The laughter that followed was not cruel, exactly, but it was dismissive in a way that cut deeper than open hostility would have. Elena stood frozen for a moment, her plate of untouched food growing heavy in her hands, as the conversation continued around her as if she had already disappeared. Someone made a joke about civilian pilots needing GPS to find the bathroom, and the laughter grew louder. Elena turned and walked away without a word, her face burning with humiliation that she hoped wasn't visible in the evening light. She dumped her food in a waste bin and made her way back to Building C, the sounds of the party fading behind her as she climbed the stairs to her empty room. She sat on her bed in the dark, looking out the window at the garbage collection area, and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake coming to Northwind Academy. But the humiliation also hardened something inside her. Elena had faced skepticism before, growing up as the daughter of immigrants in a small town where her interest in technology had been viewed as eccentric at best. She had learned to find motivation in doubt, to use other people's low expectations as fuel for her own determination. If Jackson Pierce and his friends saw her as a garage mechanic playing at being a pilot, then she would show them what a garage mechanic could accomplish when given the chance. The next morning, Elena was the first student to arrive at the simulation laboratory. She ran through exercises with methodical precision, studying not just her own performance, but analyzing the patterns and strategies employed by the top-performing students. She stayed late, practicing maneuvers until her movements became automatic, memorizing radio protocols until she could recite them in her sleep. When other students gathered for informal study sessions that she wasn't invited to join, she created her own curriculum, diving deep into tactical manuals and technical specifications that others treated as supplementary reading. Captain Rodriguez noticed the change in Elena's approach during the 7th week of training. After a particularly challenging simulation exercise, where Elena had achieved the highest score in the class while adhering perfectly to operational protocols, the instructor approached her workstation. "Martinez," she said, her voice carrying a note of approval, "whatever you're doing differently, keep doing it. Your performance metrics have improved by 30% over the past 2 weeks, and your tactical decision-making is starting to show real sophistication." Elena accepted the praise with a quiet nod, but inwardly she felt a surge of satisfaction. The recognition meant more coming from Captain Rodriguez, whose standards were notoriously high and whose approval was earned, rather than given. But she also noticed that her improved performance had not translated to improved social standing among her classmates. If anything, her success seemed to reinforce their perception that she was trying too hard, that she was an outsider attempting to prove she belonged rather than someone who naturally fit into their world. The divide became more apparent during the 8th week, when students were assigned to cross-squadron tactical exercises designed to simulate real combat operations. Elena found herself working with students from Squadron Alpha for the first time, and she approached the collaboration with cautious hope that shared professional goals might bridge some of the social distance she had experienced. The exercise was complex, involving coordination between multiple drone platforms to accomplish a series of objectives in a simulated enemy territory. Elena was assigned to fly reconnaissance missions while the Alpha Squadron members handled direct combat roles. During the pre-mission briefing, she offered tactical suggestions based on her analysis of the exercise parameters, pointing out potential vulnerabilities in their planned approach and proposing alternative strategies that might improve their chances of success. Jackson Pierce listened to her presentation with an expression of polite skepticism, nodding at appropriate intervals, but asking no questions and offering no feedback. When she finished, he thanked her for her input and then proceeded to outline the mission plan exactly as it had been originally conceived, as if her suggestions had never been offered. The exercise proceeded with predictable results. Elena's reconnaissance missions provided accurate and timely intelligence, but the tactical decisions made by the squadron leadership ignored key information she had gathered. When enemy positions she had identified were not adequately addressed in the attack plan, simulated casualties mounted quickly. The exercise ended in failure, with the mission objectives unaccomplished and significant losses sustained by the attacking force. During the post-mission debrief, the instructor analyzing the exercise highlighted several tactical errors that had led to the failure. Each of the problems he identified had been anticipated in Elena's pre-mission briefing, but when she attempted to point this out, Jackson interrupted her. "It's easy to critique decisions after you know how things turned out," he said with a dismissive wave. "Combat leadership requires making tough choices with incomplete information. That's something you learn through experience, not by reading manuals in your dorm room." The instructor moved on to other aspects of the exercise without addressing Elena's concerns, and she realized that her contributions would always be viewed through the lens of her civilian status rather than evaluated on their merit. She could be right, she could be helpful, she could even be essential to mission success, but she would never be seen as an equal participant in the process. The pattern repeated itself in subsequent exercises throughout the 8th and 9th weeks. Elena's technical performance was consistently excellent, her tactical analysis was insightful, and her contributions to mission planning were often crucial to success. But she remained socially invisible, her achievements attributed to luck or accident rather than skill, her failures seized upon as evidence of her fundamental unsuitability for military service. The social isolation began to affect her performance as the stress accumulated. Elena found herself second-guessing decisions she would have made confidently just weeks earlier, hesitating in situations where quick action was required, and trying to anticipate the reactions of her classmates rather than focusing purely on mission objectives. Her simulation scores, which had been climbing steadily, began to plateau and occasionally decline. Captain Rodriguez noticed the change. During a one-on-one evaluation session in the 10th week, after reviewing Elena's recent performance metrics, she looked up from her tablet with concern. "Martinez, your technical skills are among the best I've seen in 15 years of training drone operators. Your tactical understanding is sophisticated, and your decision-making under pressure is generally excellent. But something has changed. In the past few weeks, you're flying like someone who's afraid to make mistakes rather than someone who's focused on accomplishing the mission. What's going on?" Elena hesitated, unsure how to explain the constant weight of being judged not just on her performance, but on her right to be at Northwind Academy at all. Finally, she settled on a partial truth. "I'm still adjusting to the military environment," she said. "Learning how to work effectively with people who have different backgrounds and expectations." Captain Rodriguez studied her for a long moment, her expression suggesting she understood more than Elena had actually said. "The best drone operators I've known have come from all kinds of backgrounds. Former pilots, video game champions, mathematics professors, even a few mechanics who started out just trying to understand how the machines worked. What they all had in common wasn't their past, it was their ability to see patterns, think in 3 dimensions, and make complex decisions quickly and accurately. Don't let anyone convince you that those skills are less valuable because of where you learned them." The conversation stayed with Elena as she entered the final weeks of training. The culminating exercise was approaching, a comprehensive simulation that would test everything they had learned and determine their placement in the operational fleet. Students would be evaluated individually, but they would operate as part of integrated squadrons, requiring them to balance personal achievement with collective success. Elena threw herself into preparation with renewed intensity, but she also began to pay closer attention to the social dynamics that would shape her experience during the final exercise. She observed the informal leadership networks that connected the elite students, the communication patterns that allowed them to coordinate effectively under pressure, and the unspoken assumptions that guided their tactical thinking. What she discovered was both illuminating and troubling. The top-tier students operated within a closed system of shared references, insider knowledge, and cultural assumptions that gave them significant advantages in collaborative exercises. They communicated through subtle cues and abbreviated phrases that conveyed complex tactical concepts efficiently, but excluded anyone who hadn't been socialized into their particular military subculture. Their strategies reflected doctrine they had absorbed through family connections and academy training, giving them a framework for decision-making that allowed them to operate confidently in ambiguous situations. Elena realized that her technical superiority would be meaningless in the final exercise if she couldn't find a way to integrate effectively with students who had already decided she didn't belong. She needed to prove not just that she could fly drones and analyze tactical situations, but that she could function as a trusted member of an elite military unit. The opportunity came during the 11th week, when a scheduling error resulted in Elena being assigned to a training flight with Squadron Alpha. Jackson Pierce and 3 of his squadron mates were conducting a complex multi-platform exercise when their designated 4th pilot was unable to participate due to a medical issue. Rather than cancel the exercise, the instructor assigned Elena to fill the gap. Elena approached the mission with careful preparation, studying not just the tactical requirements, but also the communication styles and decision-making patterns she had observed among Alpha Squadron members. When the exercise began, she focused on being a seamless team member rather than trying to showcase her individual skills. The simulation involved a coordinated strike against a heavily defended target, requiring precise timing and constant communication among the 4 drone operators. Elena flew wingman to Jackson's lead, providing electronic warfare support while the other 2 squadron members conducted the primary attack. Throughout the mission, she anticipated orders before they were given, provided information in the format and timing that would be most useful to her teammates, and adapted her flying style to complement rather than compete with the other operators. The exercise was a complete success, with all objectives accomplished and minimal simulated casualties. During the post-mission debrief, Jackson looked genuinely surprised by the quality of Elena's performance. "That was solid flying," he admitted, his tone carrying a note of puzzlement. "You flew like you'd been with the squadron for months. I didn't expect. I mean, that was really professional work." Elena accepted the compliment with a simple thank you, resisting the urge to point out that she had always been capable of that level of performance. The breakthrough felt significant, but she also understood that one successful exercise wouldn't erase 10 weeks of social positioning. The final evaluation was still approaching, and her ultimate success would depend on her ability to perform when everything was on the line. As the training program entered its final week, Elena found herself in a curious position. Her technical skills were undeniable, her tactical knowledge was comprehensive, and she had demonstrated her ability to work effectively with even the most elite students. But she remained an outsider, respected for her competence, but not truly accepted as an equal. She would enter the final exercise with everything to prove and little margin for error. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning that would change everything. Elena was reviewing tactical manuals in the library when the base-wide alarm system activated, its urgent tone cutting through the normal sounds of academic routine. Within minutes, students and instructors were streaming toward the main briefing hall, where emergency protocols required all personnel to assemble for crisis notifications. Elena joined the flow of people moving through the corridors, noting the tension in faces around her and the hurried conversations that suggested something serious was happening. In the briefing hall, she found a seat in the back row and watched as senior staff members filed onto the stage with expressions that mixed urgency with grim determination. General Patricia Hawkins, the Academy Commandant, stepped to the podium with the bearing of someone accustomed to delivering news that would change lives. Her voice carried clearly through the hall's sound system as she addressed the assembled students and faculty. At 0347 this morning, our early warning systems detected an unprecedented coordinated attack against Allied forces in the Kestrel Theater. She began, her words causing an immediate stir throughout the hall. Enemy forces have launched simultaneous strikes against 12 critical installations, overwhelming local air defenses and threatening to break through our defensive perimeter. Elena felt her pulse quicken as the implications became clear. The Kestrel Theater was the primary testing ground for advanced drone warfare tactics, a region where new technologies and strategies were evaluated under real combat conditions. An attack of the scale the general described would require immediate and overwhelming response to prevent a strategic disaster. General Hawkins continued, "All operational drone units in the region have been committed to defensive operations, but initial losses have been severe. Enemy forces are employing advanced electronic warfare capabilities that are degrading the effectiveness of our standard response protocols. We need pilots who can adapt quickly to evolving threats and operate effectively in a communications-compromised environment." The hall fell silent as students began to understand where the briefing was leading. Elena noticed several instructors exchanging glances, their expressions suggesting that unprecedented decisions were being contemplated. "Under normal circumstances," the general said, "we would never consider deploying training units to active combat zones. But these are not normal circumstances. The enemy has achieved tactical surprise on a scale we have not seen in decades, and our response capacity has been stretched beyond normal limits." Elena felt the weight of expectation settling over the room as the general paused to let her words sink in. Around her, students sat with the stillness that comes from understanding that everything is about to change. "We are activating Emergency Protocol 7, General Hawkins announced. "Senior training units will be deployed to combat operations, under the direct command of experienced combat controllers. This is not a simulation. This is not an exercise. This is active military service in defense of Allied forces under attack." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of ventilation systems and the distant hum of base operations. Elena looked around the hall and saw faces that reflected a mixture of excitement, fear, and determination. For most of the students, this would be their first exposure to real combat operations. For Elena, it represented the ultimate test of everything she had learned and endured during her time at Northwind Academy. But as the details of the deployment began to emerge, it became clear that not everyone would be selected for the mission. General Hawkins explained that only the top-performing students would be chosen, those who had demonstrated not just technical proficiency, but also the tactical judgment and psychological resilience required for combat operations. Elena listened as the selection criteria were outlined, knowing that her performance metrics would qualify her for consideration, but uncertain whether her status as a civilian integration student would result in her exclusion from the most critical mission of her life. Around her, she could hear whispered conversations as students calculated their chances and speculated about who would be chosen for the unprecedented deployment. The answer came that afternoon, when squadron assignments for the emergency deployment were posted throughout the base. Elena found herself standing in a crowd of students gathered around the main bulletin board, searching for her name among the lists of selected personnel. Squadron Alpha was there in its entirety, as expected. Squadron Bravo had lost 2 members but gained replacements from lower-tier units. Squadron Charlie had been restructured completely, with several integration. Students promoted to fill gaps left by academic dismissals and medical issues. Elena's name appeared in an unexpected place: Squadron Delta, a newly formed unit composed of the highest-performing students from across all training groups. She recognized several names on the list, including Marcus Chun from Squadron Echo, and 2 Academy graduates who had consistently ranked in the top 5% of the class. But what surprised her most was the unit commander assigned to Squadron Delta, Captain Rodriguez, her former instructor, who had been selected to lead what was clearly intended to be a high-capability response unit. The deployment briefing was scheduled for 1,800 hours, giving selected students the remainder of the day to prepare equipment and mentally adjust to the reality of combat operations. Elena spent the afternoon checking and rechecking her gear, reviewing tactical manuals one final time, and trying to process the magnitude of what was about to happen. She had come to Northwind Academy hoping to prove that her unconventional background could be an asset in military service. Now she would have the opportunity to demonstrate that belief under the most demanding circumstances possible, with lives hanging in the balance and no margin for error. As evening approached and the time for the final briefing drew near, Elena found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The months of isolation, humiliation, and doubt had prepared her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She had learned to trust her own judgment even when others questioned it, to perform under pressure even when success brought no recognition, and to maintain her sense of purpose even when others tried to convince her she didn't belong. Now, with combat operations looming and everything she had worked for on the line, Elena realized that her greatest asset might not be her technical skills or tactical knowledge, but the quiet resilience she had developed through months of being underestimated and overlooked. She had nothing left to prove to herself, and that knowledge brought a sense of calm that surprised her with its intensity. The deployment briefing would begin soon, and with it, the final test of everything she had learned at Northwind Academy. Elena gathered her equipment, checked her appearance in the mirror one final time, and walked toward the briefing hall with the measured pace of someone who had found her purpose and was ready to fulfill it. The briefing hall buzzed with controlled tension as Squadron Delta assembled for their mission parameters. Elena took her assigned seat in the third row, conscious that this was the first time she had been placed among the Academy's top performers, rather than relegated to the back with other integration students. Captain Rodriguez stood at the front of the room, her expression grave as she waited for the final personnel to arrive. The lights dimmed and the main screen activated, displaying a tactical map of the Kestrel Theater, marked with red zones indicating enemy activity. Elena studied the display with growing concern. The attack pattern showed a level of coordination and strategic thinking that suggested months of planning and intelligence gathering. 12 simultaneous strikes across a front spanning 300 miles, each targeting critical communication nodes and defensive installations with precision that spoke to detailed reconnaissance. Captain Rodriguez began the briefing without preamble. Enemy forces have achieved something we thought impossible. They've managed to coordinate a multi-vector assault that has overwhelmed our early warning systems and penetrated deeper into Allied territory than any hostile action in the past decade. Intelligence suggests they're using a new generation of stealth drone technology combined with advanced electronic warfare capabilities that are proving highly effective against our standard defensive protocols. Elena felt a chill as the implications became clear. The enemy wasn't just employing superior numbers or conventional tactics. They had developed technological advantages that rendered existing defensive strategies obsolete. This wasn't a battle that could be won through traditional military thinking or established doctrine. The captain continued, "Our operational units in the theater have sustained heavy losses. Of the 48 drone platforms initially deployed for defensive operations, 31 have been destroyed or disabled. The remaining units are operating under severe communications restrictions due to enemy jamming and are unable to coordinate effectively for counterattack operations." A hand raised from the front row. Jackson Pierce, who had somehow been assigned to Squadron Delta despite his earlier dismissive attitude toward unconventional tactics, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Ma'am, what's our mission objective? Are we providing reinforcement for existing operations or conducting independent missions?" Captain Rodriguez's expression grew even more serious. "Your mission is unlike anything attempted in the history of drone warfare. Based on analysis of enemy attack patterns, Our intelligence teams have identified what they believe to be the command and control hub coordinating the entire assault. It's a heavily fortified position approximately 200 miles behind enemy lines, protected by overlapping air defense systems and surrounded by hostile territory. Elena felt her pulse quicken as she began to understand the magnitude of what they were being asked to do. A mission 200 miles into enemy territory would require flying through multiple layers of hostile air defenses, navigating without reliable communication support, and coordinating a complex attack against a target that would certainly be defended by the enemy's most capable systems. The target must be neutralized to disrupt enemy coordination and prevent them from exploiting their current tactical advantage, Captain Rodriguez continued. But conventional attack strategies won't work. The command hub is surrounded by automated defense systems that can track and engage multiple targets simultaneously. Any large formation approaching the target would be detected and destroyed long before reaching attack range. Elena studied the tactical display more carefully, noting the defensive installations marked around the target zone. Anti-aircraft missile sites, radar installations, electronic warfare nodes, and mobile patrol units created multiple overlapping layers of protection. Breaking through such a defense network would require more than firepower. It would require innovation. Your mission, the captain announced, will be to conduct a coordinated stealth penetration using advanced autonomous flight modes and distributed attack patterns. You'll operate as individual units rather than a formation, approaching the target from multiple vectors and timing your attacks to overwhelm the defensive systems through simultaneous engagement from all directions. Elena felt a surge of both excitement and apprehension. This was exactly the kind of mission her unconventional background had prepared her for. Flying complex autonomous patterns, coordinating timing across multiple platforms, adapting to unexpected defensive responses. These were skills she had developed through years of drone racing and technical experimentation, but she had never applied them in a situation where lives depended on her performance. Marcus Chun raised his hand from 2 seats away. "Ma'am, what kind of support will we have for navigation and communication once we're in hostile territory?" "Minimal," Captain Rodriguez replied bluntly. "Enemy jamming capabilities are more sophisticated than we anticipated. You'll have encrypted communication burst capability for brief status updates, but you should expect to operate independently for the majority of the mission. Navigation will be primarily through onboard systems and dead reckoning." Elena made notes in her small notebook, calculating distances and timing requirements. Operating without continuous communication support would require each pilot to maintain perfect situational awareness and adapt to changing conditions without guidance from command. It was exactly the kind of challenge that had driven her to excel during her garage experiments, where she had learned to troubleshoot problems and optimize performance without external support. The briefing continued with detailed technical specifications for the drone platforms they would be flying. Elena was surprised to learn they would be using experimental aircraft equipped with advanced stealth technology and electronic countermeasures she had only read about in classified technical manuals. The systems were more sophisticated than anything used in training, but they were also largely untested in combat conditions. "These platforms represent the cutting edge of drone warfare technology," Captain Rodriguez explained. "They're capable of autonomous flight patterns that can adapt to defensive responses in real time, but they require pilots who can think creatively and make split-second decisions without relying on standard protocols." Elena looked around the room and realized that Squadron Delta had been assembled specifically for this type of mission. Each member represented a different approach to drone operations, from Jackson's traditional military precision to Marcus's technical expertise to her own innovative problem-solving style. They weren't just the top performers from the academy. They were pilots whose diverse backgrounds and thinking styles might provide the flexibility needed for such an unprecedented challenge. The technical briefing lasted 3 hours, covering everything from weapon system specifications to emergency procedures for operating behind enemy lines. Elena absorbed every detail, but she also found herself thinking beyond the official parameters. The mission as described was possible, but extremely dangerous, with multiple points where single failures could result in mission failure or pilot casualties. But as she studied the tactical displays and listened to the operational requirements, Elena began to see patterns and possibilities that weren't being addressed in the formal briefing. The enemy's defensive strategy was sophisticated, but it followed predictable logic. Their radar systems were powerful, but they operated on frequencies that could be countered with the right electronic warfare techniques. Their missile defenses were comprehensive, but they relied on targeting algorithms that could potentially be confused by coordinated deception tactics. After the briefing concluded, Squadron Delta was given 12 hours to prepare for deployment. Elena spent the first part of that time in the technical bay, familiarizing herself with the experimental drone platform she would be flying. The aircraft was sleek and angular, its surfaces coated with radar-absorbing materials that gave it an almost organic appearance. The control systems were more advanced than anything she had experienced, with artificial intelligence components that could handle routine flight operations while allowing the pilot to focus on tactical decision-making. Elena climbed into the simulator version of her assigned aircraft and spent several hours learning its capabilities and limitations. The flight characteristics were unlike anything she had trained on, requiring a completely different approach to control inputs and navigation. But as she worked through the learning curve, she began to appreciate the sophistication of the systems and the possibilities they created for innovative tactics. The artificial intelligence component was particularly intriguing. Rather than simply following programmed flight paths, the system could analyze terrain and defensive patterns to generate optimal routes in real time. It could also coordinate with other aircraft in the formation to maintain spacing and timing without constant pilot input. Elena realized that the key to mission success would be learning to work with the AI rather than simply controlling the aircraft manually. As evening approached, Elena joined her squadron mates for a final planning session in a secure conference room. Captain Rodriguez had provided them with detailed intelligence updates and encouraged them to develop their own tactical approaches within the mission parameters. Elena listened as her colleagues proposed various strategies, noting that most of their ideas relied heavily on conventional military doctrine. Jackson Pierce advocated for a direct approach with multiple backup plans, arguing that overwhelming firepower and precise execution would carry them through any defensive challenges. Marcus Chun proposed a more technical solution, suggesting they use electronic warfare capabilities to disable defensive systems before making their attack runs. Both approaches had merit, but Elena could see potential problems with each strategy. When Captain Rodriguez asked for her input, Elena hesitated for a moment before speaking. Throughout her time at the academy, her suggestions had often been dismissed or ignored. But this mission was different. Lives were at stake, and the conventional approaches being discussed might not be sufficient for the challenges they would face. "I think we need to consider the enemy's perspective," Elena began carefully. "They've planned this assault for months, which means they've anticipated our likely responses. They know our standard tactics, and they've designed their defenses accordingly. If we approach this mission using conventional strategies, we're playing exactly the game they want us to play." Jackson frowned. "What are you suggesting? That we ignore established doctrine and make up tactics as we go along?" Elena shook her head. "I'm suggesting we use the advantages we have that they might not be expecting. Our AI systems can generate flight patterns that don't follow predictable logic. Our stealth capabilities allow us to approach from vectors they might not. be monitoring us carefully. And our coordination abilities let us create threats they can't counter with static defenses. She moved to the tactical display and began highlighting potential approach routes that avoided the most heavily defended corridors. Instead of trying to overwhelm their defenses, what if we confuse them? If we approach from multiple directions, using unpredictable flight patterns and coordinate our attacks to arrive simultaneously from vectors they can't all cover effectively? Captain Rodriguez studied the routes Elena was proposing, her expression thoughtful. You're talking about extremely complex coordination requirements. How do we maintain timing accuracy without reliable communications? Elena had been thinking about this problem since the briefing began. The AI systems can handle most of the coordination automatically once we establish the basic parameters. We set up the timing sequences before we launch, program in contingency responses for common defensive scenarios, and trust the systems to adapt as conditions change. Marcus looked skeptical. That's putting a lot of faith in untested technology. What if the AI systems don't perform as expected in combat conditions? Then we adapt, Elena replied. But conventional tactics definitely won't work against these defenses. We need to try something they haven't seen before. The discussion continued late into the evening, with each pilot contributing ideas and refinements to the emerging strategy. Elena found herself taking an increasingly central role in the planning process, not because she was asserting authority, but because her approach to the problem was generating solutions that others hadn't considered. For the first time since arriving at Northwind Academy, she felt like her unconventional perspective was being valued rather than merely tolerated. By midnight, Squadron Delta had developed a mission plan that bore little resemblance to standard military doctrine, but addressed the unique challenges they would face. Each pilot would approach the target from a different vector, using AI-generated flight patterns that would be difficult for defensive systems to predict or track. They would coordinate their attacks to arrive within a 30-second window, overwhelming the enemy's ability to respond effectively to simultaneous threats from multiple directions. Elena would lead the electronic warfare component of the attack, using her technical background to identify and exploit weaknesses in the enemy's defensive systems. Jackson would coordinate the kinetic strikes, ensuring that the physical destruction of the target was accomplished efficiently once defensive systems were compromised. Marcus would handle overall timing coordination, using his analytical skills to monitor the complex sequence of events and make real-time adjustments as needed. Captain Rodriguez reviewed their final plan with obvious concern about its complexity and reliance on unproven tactics. But she also recognized that conventional approaches offered little hope of success against the sophisticated defenses they would face. This mission depends on each of you performing beyond your training level, she told them as the planning session concluded. You'll be operating in conditions we've never simulated, using tactics we've never tested, against an enemy who has demonstrated capabilities we're still trying to understand. But you also represent the best drone operators this academy has ever produced. And your diverse backgrounds give you advantages that no previous generation of pilots has possessed. Elena felt the weight of responsibility settling over her as she prepared for what could be her final night at Northwind Academy. In 12 hours, she would either validate everything she had believed about her potential or demonstrate that her critics had been right all along. The civilian integration program, the unconventional tactics she had proposed, and her own place in military aviation would all be tested in the most demanding circumstances possible. She spent the remaining hours before launch making final preparations, checking equipment and reviewing every detail of the mission plan. But she also took time to write a brief letter to her family, trying to explain why she had chosen to pursue this path and what it meant to her to have the opportunity to serve. She sealed the letter and left it on her desk, knowing that someone would find it if she didn't return. At 0400 hours, Squadron Delta assembled in the Flight Operations Center for final systems checks and mission authorization. Elena suited up in the advanced flight gear required for extended operations, including life support systems and emergency equipment she hoped she would never need to use. The experimental drone platforms waited in the hangar, their sleek forms illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights that created sharp shadows across their radar-absorbing surfaces. Elena performed her pre-flight inspection with methodical precision, checking every system and verifying that all mission-critical components were functioning correctly. The aircraft responded to her touch like a living thing, its advanced systems coming online smoothly and confirming their readiness for operation. She climbed into the pilot station and began the startup sequence, watching as displays activated and the artificial intelligence components initialized themselves. Around the hangar, her squadron mates were going through similar preparations. Jackson moved with the confident efficiency of someone who had never doubted his abilities, while Marcus showed the careful attention to detail that had made him one of the Academy's top technical students. Captain Rodriguez moved between the aircraft, offering final guidance and ensuring that each pilot was ready for the challenges ahead. At 0530 hours, Squadron Delta received authorization for launch. Elena engaged her aircraft systems and felt the subtle vibration as the engine spun up to operational speed. The hangar doors opened slowly, revealing the pre-dawn darkness beyond and the runway that would carry them toward their destiny. One by one, the experimental aircraft rolled out of the hangar and took their positions for departure. Elena checked her instruments one final time and reviewed the mission parameters that would guide her actions over the next several hours. Everything she had learned at Northwind Academy, every skill she had developed through years of experimentation and practice, would be tested in the crucible of combat. The tower cleared Squadron Delta for takeoff, and Elena advanced her throttles to launch power. Her aircraft accelerated smoothly down the runway, its advanced systems monitoring every aspect of performance and adjusting automatically to maintain optimal efficiency. At rotation speed, she pulled back gently on the controls and felt the aircraft lift gracefully into the air. As she climbed toward operational altitude, Elena looked down at Northwind Academy falling away beneath her. The base that had been her home for 3 months looked small and insignificant from this height, its buildings and runways just geometric patterns against the desert landscape. But she carried with her everything she had learned there, both about drone operations and about her own capabilities under pressure. The flight toward the Kestrel Theater would take 4 hours, most of it over friendly territory where they could fly in formation and maintain normal communications. But as they approached enemy airspace, Squadron Delta would separate and begin the most challenging mission any of them had ever attempted. Elena settled into her pilot's seat and began the mental preparation that would carry her through whatever lay ahead. The formation flew through the dawn in disciplined silence, 4 experimental aircraft carrying pilots who represented the future of drone warfare. Elena watched the sunrise paint the clouds in brilliant colors and wondered if this would be the last peaceful moment she would experience for a very long time. Below them, the landscape gradually changed from the familiar desert terrain around Northwind Academy to the disputed territories where conventional warfare was giving way to something entirely new. As they approached the edge of enemy airspace, Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through the communication system one final time. "Squadron Delta, this is command. You are cleared for mission commencement. Maintain radio silence from this point forward unless absolutely necessary for coordination. Good luck, and remember that everything you've learned has prepared you for this moment." Elena acknowledged the transmission and watched as her squadron mates began their separation maneuvers, each aircraft turning toward its assigned approach vector. In the space of just a few minutes, she would be alone in hostile territory, responsible for decisions that could determine not Just her own survival, but the success of a mission that might change the course of an entire conflict. She checked her navigation systems one final time and began her descent toward the initial waypoint of her attack route. The artificial intelligence components of her aircraft were already analyzing defensive patterns and generating optimal flight paths. But the final decisions would be hers. Elena gripped her controls with steady hands and flew deeper into enemy territory, carrying with her the hopes of everyone who had believed in her potential and the determination to prove that unconventional thinking could succeed where traditional approaches had failed. The morning sky stretched endlessly ahead, beautiful and terrible in its vastness. Somewhere in that expanse lay a target that needed to be destroyed and defenses that had already proven their effectiveness against conventional attacks. Elena flew toward both with the calm focus that had carried her through months of doubt and preparation, ready to discover what she was truly capable of when everything was on the line. The first indication of enemy presence came as a subtle shift in her aircraft's sensor readings. Elena was 70 miles from the target when her electronic warfare systems detected radar emissions from defensive installations scattered across the landscape below. The signals were stronger and more sophisticated than intelligence reports had suggested, indicating that enemy capabilities were continuing to evolve even as the battle progressed. Elena adjusted her flight path to avoid the most concentrated sensor coverage while maintaining her scheduled arrival time at the target. The artificial intelligence systems in her aircraft were working continuously to analyze the defensive patterns and generate recommendations for optimal approach routes, but she could see that the enemy had learned from earlier engagements and adapted their tactics accordingly. She activated her stealth systems to maximum effectiveness and dropped to a lower altitude where terrain features could help mask her approach. The landscape below was harsh and mountainous, offering natural cover but also creating navigation challenges that required constant attention. Elena flew with the precision that had made her one of the Academy's top performers, threading her aircraft between radar zones and defensive installations with movements so subtle they barely registered on her own instruments. 50 miles from the target, Elena encountered the first active opposition. Her threat warning systems detected a surface-to-air missile, launched from a concealed position she hadn't identified on her approach. The missile was fast and guided by sophisticated tracking systems, but Elena had been expecting such challenges and was ready to respond. She engaged her electronic countermeasures and threw her aircraft into a series of evasive maneuvers that pushed both her skills and her equipment to their limits. The missile adjusted its course to compensate for her movements, demonstrating the advanced technology that made enemy defenses so effective. But Elena had studied the performance characteristics of such systems and knew their limitations as well as their capabilities. At the critical moment, she deployed chaff and electronic decoys while executing a sharp diving turn that took advantage of terrain masking to break the missile's lock. The weapon detonated harmlessly several hundred meters away, its explosion briefly illuminating the mountainous landscape but causing no damage to her aircraft. Elena had passed her first test of combat operations, but she knew that more challenges lay ahead. 30 miles from the target, Elena's sensors detected the approach signatures of her squadron mates as they converged on their objective from different vectors. The timing was critical. They needed to arrive simultaneously to overwhelm the defensive systems, but they also needed to avoid interfering with each other's approach routes. Elena checked her navigation systems and confirmed that she was precisely on schedule for the coordinated attack. The target began to appear on her sensors as a cluster of hardened structures surrounded by multiple layers of defensive installations. Intelligence reports had been accurate about the basic layout, but Elena could see additional defensive positions that hadn't been identified in reconnaissance images. The enemy had been busy strengthening their defenses even as the battle progressed, indicating a level of tactical awareness that made them more dangerous than anticipated. Elena activated her weapon systems and began the final approach sequence. Her aircraft's artificial intelligence components were coordinating automatically with her squadron mate's systems to ensure precise timing for the attack. But as she drew closer to the target, Elena realized that the defensive pattern was more complex than anyone had anticipated. The enemy hadn't just built static defenses around their command center. They had created a layered system of mobile units, electronic warfare nodes, and automated response systems that could adapt to incoming threats in real time. Breaking through such defenses would require more than the coordinated attack they had planned. It would require innovation under the most intense pressure imaginable. Elena made a decision that went beyond her mission parameters, but aligned with her understanding of what needed to be accomplished. Instead of proceeding directly to her assigned target point, she adjusted her approach to focus on the electronic warfare systems that were coordinating the enemy's defensive response. If she could disrupt their ability to coordinate defensive fires, her squadron mates would have a much better chance of reaching their objectives. 20 miles from the target, Elena encountered the most sophisticated defensive challenge she had ever faced. Multiple tracking systems locked onto her aircraft simultaneously, while surface-to-air missiles launched from concealed positions all around her approach route. The enemy had identified her as a priority threat and was committing significant resources to stopping her advance. Elena responded with every skill she had developed through months of training and years of experimentation. She flew her aircraft through a complex series of evasive maneuvers, while simultaneously engaging multiple defensive systems with her electronic warfare capabilities. Her hands moved across the controls with fluid precision, making hundreds of micro-adjustments that kept her aircraft just ahead of the tracking systems trying to target her. The artificial intelligence components of her aircraft were working at maximum capacity to process the overwhelming amount of information and generate optimal responses to each threat. But Elena realized that the systems were being pushed beyond their design parameters by the intensity of the defensive fire. She would need to rely on her own judgment and reflexes to navigate the final approach to the target. 10 miles from the objective, Elena achieved the breakthrough that would determine the mission's outcome. Her electronic warfare attack successfully penetrated the enemy's command and control network, creating cascading failures throughout their defensive system. Surface-to-air missile sites went offline, radar installations lost tracking capability, and coordination between defensive units collapsed just as her squadron mates began their final attack runs. Elena watched through her sensors as Jackson's aircraft delivered precision strikes against the primary target structures, while Marcus's electronic warfare attacked disabled backup systems and communication nodes. The coordinated assault was devastating in its effectiveness, overwhelming the enemy's ability to respond and achieving complete destruction of the command center that had been coordinating attacks throughout the theater. But Elena's role in the mission wasn't finished. As Squadron Delta prepared to withdraw from the target area, new defensive systems came online from previously undetected positions. The enemy had held reserves in readiness for exactly this type of attack, and they were now deploying capabilities that threatened to prevent the squadron's successful extraction. Elena made another decision that exceeded her mission parameters, but reflected her understanding of leadership responsibility. Instead of withdrawing immediately as planned, she remained in the target area to provide electronic warfare support for her squadron mates' escape routes. Her aircraft became the focus of intense defensive fire as enemy systems tried to eliminate the threat she represented to their ability to track and engage the other Squadron Delta aircraft. Flying through a storm of surface-to-air missiles and defensive fire, Elena used every advanced technique she had learned to keep her aircraft operational while providing the electronic coverage her teammates needed to escape safely. Her systems were being pushed to their absolute limits, with multiple warning indicators showing critical damage to various aircraft components. But Elena's unconventional background and innovative thinking provided advantages that traditional military training couldn't match. She improvised solutions to system failures, adapted her tactics to compensate for battle damage, and maintained effective electronic warfare coverage, even as her aircraft sustained hits that would have forced most pilots to abort their missions. The withdrawal phase of the mission lasted 45 minutes of the most intense flying Elena had ever experienced. She shepherded her squadron mates through multiple defensive zones while fighting off continuous attacks against her own aircraft. By the time Squadron Delta reached friendly airspace, Elena's aircraft was barely operational, sustained by emergency systems and held together by determination as much as engineering. But the mission had succeeded beyond all expectations. The enemy command center had been completely destroyed. Their coordination capabilities had been disrupted throughout the theater, and Allied forces were already beginning to exploit the tactical advantage created by Squadron Delta's attack. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces were withdrawing from advanced positions and attempting to re-establish defensive lines much further from Allied territory. As Elena guided her damaged aircraft toward the emergency landing field, she reflected on everything that had brought her to this moment. The months of isolation and humiliation at Northwind Academy had prepared her for the mental challenges of operating alone under extreme pressure. The technical skills she had developed through years of experimentation had provided the innovative thinking needed to overcome sophisticated defensive systems, and the quiet resilience she had maintained through constant doubt had given her the determination to exceed mission parameters when leadership was required. Squadron Delta touched down at the emergency airfield as heroes, their successful completion of an impossible mission already becoming legend throughout the Allied forces. Elena climbed out of her damaged aircraft on unsteady legs, her flight suit stained with sweat and her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline that was only beginning to subside. Captain Rodriguez was waiting for her as she completed her post-flight inspection, the instructor's face showing a mixture of pride and amazement that Elena had never seen before. Other pilots and ground crew members gathered around Squadron Delta, their expressions revealing that word of the mission's success had already spread throughout the base. But Elena felt no sense of triumph or vindication as she stood among the people who were calling her a hero. She had proven everything she had set out to prove, but the cost of that proof had been measured in lives and destruction that would affect countless people for years to come. The mission had been necessary, but Elena understood that success in combat operations was always temporary, and that the real measure of her achievements would be what came next. As debriefing sessions began and intelligence analysts started processing the tactical information Squadron Delta had gathered, Elena found herself thinking about the future rather than celebrating the past. The unconventional tactics that had made their mission possible represented a fundamental shift in how drone warfare would be conducted, and she realized that her role in developing those innovations was just beginning. The simple woman who had arrived at Northwind Academy as a civilian integration student had become something entirely different through the crucible of combat operations. Elena Martinez had demonstrated that the future of military aviation belonged not to those who followed established doctrine, but to those who could think beyond traditional limitations and adapt to challenges that no one had faced before. The debriefing room fell silent as Elena finished recounting the mission's electronic warfare phases. Senior officers who had spent decades in military service sat motionless, processing tactical innovations they had never imagined possible. General Hawkins leaned forward in her chair, studying the mission data displayed on multiple screens around the room. "Let me understand this correctly, Martinez," the general said slowly. "You identified 12 separate defensive nodes that weren't in our intelligence reports, adapted your electronic warfare protocols in real time to counter systems we've never encountered before, and coordinated simultaneous attacks from 4 different vectors while under continuous hostile fire. Elena nodded simply. Yes, ma'am. The enemy's defensive network was more sophisticated than anticipated, but it followed predictable logic patterns once you understood their coordination algorithms. A colonel from Strategic Command spoke up from across the table. Our best electronic warfare specialists have been trying to crack those coordination systems for months. How did you identify the vulnerabilities so quickly? Elena paused, considering how to explain thinking processes that had become instinctive through years of experimentation. The defensive systems were designed to counter conventional attack patterns, but they weren't optimized for the kind of distributed coordination our eye systems could generate. Once I recognized that gap, it was a matter of exploiting their rigid programming with adaptive responses they couldn't predict. General Hawkins exchanged glances with her staff officers before continuing. The tactical data you gathered during the mission has already revolutionized our understanding of enemy capabilities. Intelligence estimates suggest your electronic warfare breakthrough delayed their next major offensive by at least 6 months while they redesigned their defensive networks. Elena accepted this information without visible emotion, but inwardly she felt the weight of understanding how profoundly the mission had affected the broader conflict. The innovations Squadron Delta had employed weren't just successful tactics, they represented a fundamental shift in how future drone operations would be conducted. Captain Rodriguez, who had remained silent during most of the debriefing, finally spoke. Martinez demonstrated leadership qualities that went far beyond her mission. Parameters. When the extraction became complicated, she made the decision to remain in hostile territory to provide cover for her squadron mates. That kind of tactical judgment and personal courage isn't something you can teach in a classroom. The formal debriefing concluded with Elena providing detailed technical specifications for the countermeasures she had developed during combat operations. Military engineers were already analyzing her innovations to determine how they could be integrated into standard operating procedures. The unconventional thinking that had once marked her as an outsider was now being studied as the foundation for next-generation tactical doctrine. But Elena's transformation from integration student to combat leader had created ripple effects that extended far beyond tactical innovations. As word of Squadron Delta's success spread throughout the military establishment, questions began emerging about how such exceptional capabilities had been overlooked during conventional evaluation processes. 3 days after the mission, Elena found herself summoned to a meeting with the Northwind Academy leadership team. She arrived at the administration building wearing a fresh uniform that bore new insignia reflecting her field promotion to lieutenant, a rank advancement that had been processed with unprecedented speed following her combat performance. The conference room contained faces she recognized from her first day at the academy, but the dynamics had shifted completely. Administrators who had barely acknowledged her existence now stood as she entered, and chairs were repositioned to ensure she had a place at the head of the table rather than being relegated to the periphery. General Hawkins opened the meeting with an acknowledgement that surprised Elena with its directness. Lieutenant Martinez, your performance during the Kestrel theater operation has forced us to re-examine fundamental assumptions about pilot selection and training methodologies. The civilian integration program that brought you to Northwind was considered experimental at best, but your success suggests we may have been overlooking critical sources of talent. Elena listened as the conversation continued around her, but she found herself thinking about the other integration students who hadn't been selected for combat operations. Marcus Chen had performed exceptionally during the mission, but what about the students who hadn't been given the opportunity to demonstrate their capabilities under pressure? How many potential innovations had been lost because unconventional backgrounds were viewed as liabilities rather than assets? The Academy Commandant, who had signed Elena's original acceptance letter with obvious reluctance, now spoke with enthusiasm about expanding the integration program. We're proposing to triple the number of civilian candidates accepted for each training cycle. Lieutenant Martinez has proven that diverse backgrounds can provide exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need for evolving warfare challenges. Elena felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and concern as she listened to plans being developed around her success. The recognition was gratifying after months of isolation and doubt, but she also understood that her individual achievement was being used to justify broader changes that might not serve the interests of future students. When asked for her recommendations about program modifications, Elena chose her words carefully. The integration program worked for me because I had the opportunity to develop my skills without being forced into conventional patterns. But success wasn't just about technical innovation. It required understanding military culture and learning to work effectively within established systems. Future integration students will need better support for that cultural adaptation process. General Hawkins nodded thoughtfully. What kind of support structures do you think would be most effective? Elena had been thinking about this question since her first week at the academy. Integration students need mentorship from officers who understand unconventional backgrounds, opportunities to contribute meaningfully to mission planning from early in their training, and evaluation criteria that recognize innovative thinking rather than just compliance with established procedures. The discussion continued for 2 hours, covering everything from admission criteria to curriculum modifications. Elena found herself in the unusual position of helping to design programs that would affect future generations of military pilots. But she also recognized that her influence was temporary, and that institutional momentum would ultimately determine how her recommendations were implemented. As the meeting concluded, Elena was informed that she would be remaining at Northwind Academy as an instructor specializing in advanced electronic warfare tactics and unconventional mission planning. The assignment was presented as a recognition of her expertise, but Elena understood that it also served the Academy's need to capitalize on her visibility and success. Over the following weeks, Elena settled into her new role with the same methodical approach she had applied to her studies. Teaching advanced tactics to students who had initially viewed her as an outsider required diplomatic skills she had never needed to develop, but she found satisfaction in helping others understand concepts that had become intuitive through her combat experience. The transformation in how she was perceived by both students and faculty was remarkable but also somewhat hollow. Elena recognized that respect based on a single dramatic achievement was different from acceptance based on genuine understanding of her capabilities and contributions. The same people who had dismissed her potential were now eager to claim association with her success. Jackson Pierce was among the students in Elena's first advanced tactics seminar, and his presence created an awkward dynamic that neither of them addressed directly. During classroom discussions, he contributed thoughtful questions and demonstrated genuine interest in the unconventional approaches Elena was teaching, but their interactions remained formal and careful. After a particularly challenging session on adaptive electronic warfare techniques, Jackson remained behind as other students filed out of the classroom. Elena busied herself organizing training materials while he approached her desk with obvious hesitation. "Lieutenant Martinez," he began, his voice lacking the confident authority that had once characterized his every statement. "I wanted to apologize for my behavior during our training cycle. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on your background rather than evaluating your actual performance. That was unprofessional and unfair." Elena looked up from her materials and studied his expression, searching for signs of insincerity or calculation. What she saw instead was genuine regret and a humility that suggested real personal growth rather than opportunistic positioning. "I appreciate that, Jackson," she replied, using his first name for the first time since they had met. "We all make judgments based on limited information. The important thing is learning from those mistakes and doing better in the future." Jackson nodded, seeming relieved by her response. "Your mission innovations have changed how I think about tactical planning. I've been studying your electronic warfare techniques, but I'm struggling to understand how you develop such non-linear approaches to defensive countermeasures." Elena recognized a genuine learning opportunity beneath his question. For the next hour, she walked Jackson through the thought processes that had led to her combat innovations, explaining how her garage experimentation with racing drones had taught her to think beyond conventional flight patterns and defensive strategies. As their conversation continued, Elena realized that Jackson's transformation reflected broader changes occurring throughout the academy. Students who had once viewed unconventional thinking as a weakness were beginning to understand it as a critical asset for future military operations. The rigid hierarchies based on family background and traditional credentials were giving way to more fluid structures that valued innovation and adaptability. But Elena also observed that institutional change was occurring slowly and unevenly. While her individual success had created opportunities for recognition and advancement, the underlying cultural patterns that had initially marginalized her remained largely intact. Future integration students would face many of the same challenges she had encountered, even if they were now given more opportunities to prove their capabilities. 3 months after the Kestrel Theater mission, Elena received orders for her next assignment. The Strategic Combat Development Center had requested her specifically to lead a team developing next-generation drone warfare tactics. The position would take her away from Northwind Academy, but would provide opportunities to influence military doctrine at the highest levels. Elena's departure from the academy was marked by a formal ceremony that drew senior officers from throughout the military establishment. General Hawkins presented her with commendations, recognizing both her combat achievements and her contributions to tactical innovation. But Elena found the public recognition less meaningful than the private conversation she had with individual students and faculty members. Captain Rodriguez, who had become both mentor and friend during Elena's transformation from integration student to combat leader, offered advice that would guide Elena's future career. "You've proven that unconventional thinking can succeed within military structures, but don't let that success change who you are. The innovation that made you exceptional came from maintaining your unique perspective while learning to work effectively within established systems." Elena carried that guidance with her as she began her new assignment at the Strategic Combat Development Center. The facility was located in a secure complex outside Washington, where the military's most advanced thinkers worked on concepts that would shape warfare for decades to come. Elena's team included officers from every branch of service, civilian, scientists, and technology specialists whose diverse backgrounds created exactly the kind of innovative environment she had always thrived in. Her first major project involved developing tactical doctrine for autonomous drone swarms capable of coordinating complex operations without human oversight. The technical challenges were immense, but Elena's experience with adaptive AI systems during the Kestrel Theater mission provided insights that proved crucial to the project's success. Working with autonomous swarms required thinking about drone operations in fundamentally different ways. Instead of controlling individual aircraft, operators needed to manage emergent behaviors arising from interactions between multiple systems. Elena's background in racing drone coordination translated directly to swarm management concepts, but applying those principles to military operations required new approaches to command and control. Over the following year, Elena's team developed doctrine that revolutionized how the military approached unmanned operations. Their innovations enabled single operators to coordinate dozens of aircraft simultaneously, creating tactical capabilities that overwhelmed conventional defensive systems through sheer complexity and adaptability. But Elena's greatest contribution to military science wasn't technical innovation. It was demonstrating that exceptional capabilities could emerge from unexpected sources when institutional barriers were removed. Her success encouraged the military to expand recruitment beyond traditional channels and to develop evaluation methods that recognize diverse forms of excellence. The changes Elena had catalyzed extended far beyond drone operations. Military academies across all services began implementing integration programs designed to identify and develop unconventional talent. Selection criteria were modified to recognize innovative thinking alongside traditional measures of aptitude and achievement. Training methodologies evolved to accommodate diverse learning styles and background experiences. 5 years after leaving Northwind Academy, Elena was promoted to major and assigned to command an experimental squadron testing cutting-edge autonomous warfare concepts. Her unit operated from a classified facility where the most advanced military technologies were developed and evaluated under conditions that pushed both equipment and personnel to their absolute limits. Elena's squadron included pilots from every conceivable background: former video game champions, mathematics professors, mechanical engineers, and even artists whose spatial reasoning abilities had proven invaluable for complex three-dimensional operations. The diversity that had once marked Elena as an outsider now characterized the most elite units in military service. But success hadn't eliminated the challenges that came with being different. Elena still encountered officers who questioned whether unconventional approaches could be trusted in critical situations, and she continued to face skepticism about promoting diversity within military ranks. The difference was that she now had the authority and credibility to address those concerns directly rather than enduring them silently. During a joint training exercise with international partners, Elena encountered resistance from allied officers who preferred traditional operational methods. When her squadron's autonomous systems consistently outperformed conventional units in tactical scenarios, some participants suggested that the results were due to unfair technological advantages rather than superior tactical thinking. Elena addressed these concerns during a briefing for senior international commanders, explaining how her team's innovations had emerged from combining diverse perspectives with advanced technology. She demonstrated that the tactical advantages came not from superior equipment, but from thinking differently about how that equipment could be employed. Technology alone doesn't create tactical advantages, Elena explained to the assembled officers. Innovation comes from understanding problems in new ways and developing solutions that conventional thinking wouldn't consider. The diversity of backgrounds in my squadron provides exactly that kind of innovative capability. The international exercise concluded with Elena's squadron achieving objectives that conventional forces had considered impossible, but more importantly, it established principles for international cooperation in developing next-generation military capabilities. Elena's approach to innovation became a model for how diverse teams could outperform traditional military units through collaborative problem-solving. 10 years after her graduation from Northwind Academy, Elena was promoted to colonel and assigned to lead the Military Innovation Institute, a new organization created specifically to identify and develop unconventional approaches to emerging security challenges. Her appointment represented the military's recognition that future conflicts would require fundamentally different thinking about warfare and technology. The institute operated from a modern campus that brought together military officers, civilian scientists, technology entrepreneurs, and international partners in an environment designed to foster creative collaboration. Elena's role involved not just managing technical projects, but also identifying talented individuals whose backgrounds might not fit traditional military profiles. Under Elena's leadership, the Institute developed breakthrough technologies and tactical concepts that influenced military doctrine worldwide. But perhaps more significantly, it demonstrated that exceptional achievements could emerge from embracing diversity rather than enforcing conformity. Elena's personal transformation from dismissed integration student to leading military innovator had taken 15 years, But the institutional changes she had catalyzed continued expanding long after her individual achievements. Military recruitment had evolved to actively seek unconventional talent. Training programs had been redesigned to accommodate diverse learning styles, and evaluation criteria had been modified to recognize innovative thinking as a core military capability. The simple woman who had stepped off a shuttle bus at Northwind Academy carrying nothing but determination and a homemade flight controller had become a symbol of how exceptional capabilities could emerge from unexpected sources. But Elena understood that her greatest contribution wasn't her individual success. It was proving that military effectiveness could be enhanced rather than compromised by embracing diversity and innovation. As Elena stood in her office overlooking the Military Innovation Institute campus, watching diverse teams of scientists and officers working on projects that would shape the future of warfare, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this position. The humiliation and isolation she had endured at Northwind Academy had prepared her for challenges she couldn't have imagined, while the technical skills she had developed in her garage had provided capabilities the military desperately needed. But most importantly, Elena had learned that true strength came not from conforming to expectations but from maintaining the courage to be different when difference was needed most. The quiet resilience that had carried her through months of doubt had become a leadership philosophy that empowered others to achieve their own extraordinary potential. Elena's story had become legend within military circles, inspiring countless individuals who had been told they didn't fit traditional profiles to pursue careers in service. Integration programs bearing her name operated at military academies worldwide, while tactical innovations based on her combat experience continued influencing how conflicts were fought and won. The transformation was complete, but never finished. Elena continued pushing boundaries, developing new concepts, and identifying emerging talent that might otherwise be overlooked. She had proven that excellence could emerge from anywhere when institutional barriers were removed and diverse perspectives were valued rather than merely tolerated. The woman who had once sat alone in dining halls and endured mocking comments about her civilian background now shaped military policy at the highest levels. But Elena never forgot the isolation and doubt that had almost convinced her to abandon her dreams, using those memories to ensure that future generations of unconventional talent would find the support and opportunities they needed to serve with distinction. Her legacy wasn't measured in combat victories or technological breakthroughs, significant though those achievements were. Elena's greatest contribution was demonstrating that military effectiveness could be enhanced by embracing diversity and that innovation emerged most readily from environments where different perspectives were valued and nurtured. The garage mechanic who had thought she could become a combat pilot had proven herself right. But more importantly, she had opened doors for countless others who carried similar dreams and unconventional capabilities. Elena Martinez had changed not just military doctrine, but military culture itself, creating space for excellence to emerge from sources that conventional wisdom would never have considered. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.